Great. It looks like we have a good group here. So maybe we'll go ahead and kind of get the ball rolling with some of the introduction information. Just first of all, thanks, big thanks to everyone for taking time to join us today. I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation. There's a lot to discuss in this topic. Before we begin, we want to make sure that everyone knows that there is French interpretation available for the webinar. Si vous préférez suivre en français, vous devrez cliquer sur le petit globe en bas de votre écran où il est écrit interprétation et puis sélectionner français et puis choisir mute original audio ou laisser l'anglais de jouer à un volume plus bas. For the English speakers, you can select English on the interpretation button. That's the little globe at the bottom of your screen. And then mute the original audio so that you don't hear double language. If you have any technical issues during the session, please just send a chat in the chat box to Scale, and we'll do our best to assist you. So also, I know many of you have done this already, but as we get started, if you could put your name and where you're joining us from today in the chat box, just so the panelists and I can know where you're coming from, who we've got in the room. It's always nice to know who's joining us. However, if you have questions for the panelists, and I hope you have lots of questions, we've got some really good panelists and discussion here, please put them in the Q&A box. You'll see that one down at the bottom of your screen, Q&A. If you put questions for the panelists in the chat box, we won't see them. But if you put it in Q&A, that's where we'll be looking for your questions. It also gives you a chance to give a thumbs up to any good questions that maybe somebody else asked. The more thumbs up something gets, that way we know that you're interested in a particular topic. We can make sure it gets asked to the panelists. And anything that we don't have time for during this session, we'll make sure to put into a document with Q&A, with the answers to the Q&A at the end. And I think that is all of the introduction and logistics stuff. Again, I want to remind you, if you have any technical issues, just let someone know in the chat box and we'll make sure that you get the support you need. So, as many of you know, Scale is designed to support research, capacity strengthening, and knowledge sharing for partners of USAID's Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance. So Scale's work is really around strengthening the impact and sustainability and scalability of agriculture, natural resource management, and off-farm and on-farm livelihoods, both in development contexts and in emergency contexts as well. My name is Carrie Byrne, and I'm the Livelihoods Advisor for Scale. And today we're going to be talking about the challenges and opportunities around migration. And this is a topic I think that we've seen in the press a lot in recent years. But as all of us in this room probably feel when we read those news stories, there's a lot of subtleties that are missed in the discussion that's in the wider world. For example, while about 5% of the worldwide labor force are economic migrants, and that's split not quite evenly between men and women. Men are about 58% and women make up about 42%. Nevertheless, 80% of female migrants are working in the services sector. And that's a sector that was hit a lot harder by the pandemic than other sectors were. We also know that economic migrants send home a lot of remittances, and many families around the world rely on those remittances. In fact, it's about 689 billion prior to the pandemic. That's 3 times the amount of official aid, official development assistance, ODA. So the pandemic has had this massive effect, not only on irregular migration, but also even on legal migration. And when we talk about migration, it's just really clear that there are lots of elements to consider, these different populations, different economic sectors to consider, different levels of safety or legality, and also different things that lead people to become migrants in the first place. It's really different in each context. So we have lots to talk about here and some great panelists. Let me introduce you to our panelists. We have Walter Mwasa, who is the Chief of Party for CARE's Tekunda Resilience Food Security Activity in Zimbabwe, which is a USAID BHA program. We have Pascal Wagner, who is the Guatemala Country Director for PCI Global Communities. And we have Beza Tesfaye, Director of Research and Learning for Migration and Climate Change at Mercy Corps. So Walter, I'm going to point my first question to you. Now, I understand that CARE's Tekunda project was designed to find ways to integrate migration into livelihoods approaches, to support safe migration and ensure project participants get the skills and the knowledge that they need. Now, I know this project's just started, but it's also, if I understand you correctly, it's built on lots of previous work that you've done. So tell us what CARE learned in past programs that made you design the program maybe differently.
Thank you, Carrie and Scale, for the opportunity, and to all the participants, welcome. I think what I want to start with is just a bit of our understanding of migration. I think there's multiple conversations. There could be a seasonal migration. There could be temporary migration where you have a family member working in the city and the rest of the family out in the villages. And then you also have people who eventually move out. And I'll just give a bit of experience from my Ethiopia times where we were able to see, because of climate change and other reasons, people move out of specific locations. So migration is wide. It's not just one or the other. And I think we need to set that tone as we talk about the migration conversation today. Now, why do we want to look at this in the way we have? And just narrowing down to Zimbabwe, which is where I'm working currently, I think CARE has actually learned from previous interventions that a lot of households in this country do actually have a lot of support and resources that do come from migrant people. And we need to look at this because we also have legal and illegal migration. And I think just last night or 2 nights ago, the minister actually did confirm that there's easily close to 3 million people from Zimbabwe who are just across the border in South Africa. How they end up there is something we can debate. But what do they do to the community? What do they do to their own homestead? So really what they bring back is a big thing, and we want to make sure that that migration is meaningful. I think there's also that risk of, do people have good outcomes when they get out there? So as we trace and track what these people are doing and how their households are interacting with their realities, we also need to be aware, are they prepared? Are they ready? Do they end up with the right kind of support systems out there in the context that they move to? What do they expect to get when they go there? And it could be just to Europe. It may not be next door. It could also be from the village to an urban center. So migration, as we understand, has actually had an impact on people's lives, but we also need to dig a little deeper, and that's what Tekunda is going to be looking at. What does it really mean to have meaningful and profitable migration for the people that move, not just adults, but also the youth? Thank you.
Thanks, Walter. Now, Pascal, PCI is also working in an area of Guatemala that is facing a lot of different kinds of migration, but you're working with more traditional style livelihoods programs. So what kind of challenges are your programs facing given that context that you're working in? Pascal, you're...
Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry about that. Good morning, and thanks, Carrie. Indeed, the PCI Global Communities, we're working in Huehuetenango, which is a department in Guatemala that borders with Mexico. So therefore, a lot of the migrants go through Huehuetenango in order to get to Mexico and then the US. And of course, a lot of people from Huehuetenango are also migrating. I'd like to recognize that the livelihoods program that we have in Mauritania would definitely attenuate some of the push factors, such as creating new opportunities, economic opportunities, which is what people are lacking, and that reduces poverty. And the programs also improve health, food availability and access, nutrition, which are all push factors. The lack of all these things are definitely, of all these services and goods availability is definitely part of the push factors. What we've encountered as challenges in our program in Wewetenango is, for example, the fact that a lot of the families, a lot of the households now are headed by a woman, and they already had a very heavy workload, and now the workload is even heavier. There is the field that needs to be worked, children to take care of, the house itself to take care of, maybe some elderly family members that need to be taken care of. So a very heavy load on women already. So there is little time for them at times to participate in the program activities. So that has been an issue. The other one is that a lot of these women that are staying behind are not fully empowered, and they still need to have. There's a bit of machismo in Wewetenango and in Guatemala in general, and there is they need to have their authorization of their husband or of their in-laws just to access a health service. So if they don't, you could have a woman who's in labor, who needs to be taken to the hospital, and she won't until she has the permission, the authorization from someone in the family, an elderly or her husband. So that creates issues at times that even put people's lives at stake. Another issue is, in general, the family disintegration. You have families that are split. The husbands live for the states, even taking sometimes some of the children, and that creates a family disintegration. That creates depression in some people, anxiety because they don't know how it's going for their family members in the states, and that has also its impact on the program implementation. You see people always worried, people that are impressed that are not fully engaged for the same reason.
Great. And tell me, Pascal, what about climate change? Actually, I'll want to hear from you as well, Walter. How are the impacts of climate change kind of pushing you to think differently about the way you're doing your programming, and what's the relationship with the migration and climate change?
Excellent, Carrie. It's a big issue because climate changes are real, as we know, and their effects is definitely affecting the communities. And what that has created is that first of all, young people no longer want to work the field because it's very hard work. You break your back working in the land, and then you don't get what you expect. But also, their expectations have been killed so many times. There are lots of droughts followed by floods. So, you grow the land, you plant seeds, you buy fertilizers, you invest in all these plantation, and then you have a drought that lasts 4 months or 5 months, and you lose everything. And then after the drought, there's a little bit of rain, you start planting again, and there's a huge flood. Everything is washed out. So that has happened over and over. And I really think it is a major push factors. The fact that the land that people have had for generations is no longer producing enough to feed the family. So you put yourselves in their shoes. If you cannot feed your family, what do? You look for a different territory. You look for another territory where you can ensure that your family will have enough food on the table.
Absolutely. Walter, what are you seeing in Zimbabwe or other places that you've worked around the impact of climate change on migration?
Yeah, so I think when we talk climate change and what it really means for an individual household is income. Am I still able to take care of my cattle? Am I still able to, as Pascal did say, harvest the same crops and the same levels to sustain my family needs? What we obviously notice as the droughts begin to get harsher and longer and more frequent, people are having to adapt to different choices, and not all those choices will be available in the locality. So we do see what we'd call climate migrants moving out to either cities or across the border, and some of them may be able to reallocate themselves within the setup. I'll specifically talk about countries like Bangladesh or Ethiopia, where we've seen with the frequent flooding, the increase, the rising river levels, just people have no alternative, they have to move. In Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa, with all the droughts we've seen, the pastoral communities have to find other things to do. And those other things are not found in those dry areas. People have to relocate to cities. And I have to say a lot of what you're seeing crossing into the Mediterranean is a lot to do with the need to people to provide for themselves and their families. So absolutely, yes, it's a big issue, and we need to be taking into account what this means for the rural household. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's really, I know I saw some research from Nigeria that talked about how important it was to really disaggregate between different push factors. It was talking about how in one case having livestock meant that you stayed, but having a lot of land meant that you were more likely to go, and just some real interesting subtleties. This is probably a great time to turn to you, Beza, and tell us about, so your colleagues looked at how economic migration could be a component of our livelihoods and development strategies. And you did case studies on Niger and Nepal. So what were the findings or some of the findings from those case studies?
Thank you, Carrie, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Yeah, so the research that we recently published on this topic looked at the relationship between migration and development and how those two things reinforce each other. And we decided to focus on Niger and Nepal as case studies because these are two countries that have historically high rates of rural to urban migration. And in our study, we interviewed migrants as well as the households from which they migrated. So their spouses, their family members, and so on. And then we also conducted a few interviews with experts, donors, and practitioners that were also working on these issues. And what we found is at the household and at the individual level in these two countries, migration is really a key livelihood strategy. And it was something that offered potential benefits for these households, but it also brought certain challenges or risks alongside with those benefits. And I'll take the example of Niger because it's the country that I worked most closely on. And when you think Niger is located in the Sahel. It's a place that is facing harsh environmental conditions and is grappling with the fallout of climate change. In Niger, there's a practice that's known as l'exode in French, which is a form of seasonal migration by which men from rural areas will migrate to urban areas. Most of them stay within Niger, but a large number of them also go to neighboring countries. And what is unique about Niger in some ways is that because it's located within the ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, Nigerians have the legal right of free movement to other member states. So many people take advantage of this opportunity and will migrate from rural Niger to urban areas like Abidjan or Lagos and other cities to seek employment in these larger labor markets. And what we heard from the families that we interviewed and the migrants is that there were many benefits to this. The most obvious benefit, again, is that people were able to find work and that gave them a source of income. And as such, they were able to send that money back home and invest in different things within their home communities. There was also the acquisition of skills over time. When people went to these other locations, they brought back skills with them. And interestingly, over time, people also helped to create a social network between their home communities and the destinations that they were going to. So that helped to establish a support for new migrants. You can imagine it helps to create these diaspora communities in some of the cities. At the same time, as I mentioned, I was going to say there were also challenges, and I don't want to overlook or minimize them. So, you know, I wanted to echo something that Pascal said. I think one of the big challenges are for the families that remain behind, because they oftentimes they're grappling with the loss of a household member, especially in Niger. It's often women that stay in rural areas, and they have to sort of pick up the burden within their households. So that's just, I guess, one example of the trade-off that these households face.
Yeah, so all of you in different ways have talked about, you know, the point you just made about the family needing to, women taking on a higher level of work. Walter, you made a point. Oh, and now it's just left my head. But what I'm hearing is that there are all these pieces that we would normally, the development community would try to address that women's added workload, or the need to migrate legally, right? Just as a part of agriculture labor, for example. And yet, I think one of the things that keeps coming up is that our aid structure isn't designed to easily allow us to make our livelihoods programs recognize people being in different locations, and you know, cross-border programs often get very complicated very, very quickly. So from all the experience that you have working in the field or researching around this, what would you say are the assumptions? And this is really a question for all of you, any of you. What are the assumptions that we should be questioning in our own program design or in the way we evaluate programs? How should we be looking at this differently so that we can design programs that more effectively address those things that we want to address in households anyway, the food insecurity, the, you know, health and well-being of these families, the resilience. A lot of what you were talking about, Walter, was around resilience. So I leave that as an open question for each of you. Who wants to start for me? Walter, I'm gonna pick on you. How do you think we should be thinking about this issue differently?
I'm sorry, I think I had an internet glitch there. I think one of the things that we need to be looking at is really, first of all, understanding that migration isn't necessarily negative. And I think that's a very critical point to put on the ground before we start. And once you move beyond that, then you start looking at what does it take to meaningfully migrate, and how do we prepare potential migrants, because they're going to do it. And this is age old. I must say, my great uncle came to Zimbabwe as a migrant, hunting trophy elephants or something, whatever he was doing here. And that's reality. People step out of their countries to go and look for something to make ends meet. Now, what we are learning in the work we are doing in care is that the first critical thing is to understand first, where do people come from? What skills do they have? What are the opportunities that exist where they go? And where is that information coming from? The absence of information can actually be very misguiding. A lot of us growing in Africa think you go to the US and you become rich overnight. Well, we know that's not necessarily the case. And so what information are we providing to younger people, to potential migrants, in terms of what they will find and what they have to be prepared for? It could be the skills, it could be the social setup, it could be the legal setup that is required of them before they can make those moves. The other thing which is pulling back a little is to understand, why are people migrating? In Zimbabwe, as we've been starting our project, we are talking to communities, and what we are seeing is a mixed feeling in terms of people just don't really want to move. I would say 50-50. There are those who are like, if I didn't need to move, I wouldn't move. And there are those who are like, I'm gonna move if there's an opportunity. And so we are seeing a mix of that. So being able as a development worker to really understand why people move, and is it something they do out of choice, out of compulsion, would really help you to better engage and develop that supportive mechanism for that individual. The last thing that I would throw so that I can leave to other people is really thinking a little about the younger people. And what we are seeing, and it's an interesting discussion here, is that we also see what we call circular migration, or I would say layered migration. So I move from my village, I go to a city, I end up in another city. It's very unstructured. And I think often this is where we see a lot of negative results, because your family can't even trace you. They don't know where you are. They know you left, they hear you in a certain town. And I would say that's a person at risk. So how do you get that person prepped, connected, and really ready for what it may, and oftentimes reintegrate them? I think we do talk about reintegration if people can come home. What opportunities may be there? And just to say that, yeah, there must be that place where somebody can say, I better return. And I think it's just looking at that whole circle of migration and the experiences that people have.
Yeah, there's lots of protection issues in there, aren't there?
Absolutely.
Pascal, you were talking about some of the protection issues. Do you want to kind of jump on that and tell us how should we be looking at these problems differently, or what kind of recommendations or examples would you say are needed?
I agree with you, Carrie, that the protection issue is huge, both for returnees, for people that are coming back, for people that are left behind, and for the migrants themselves, of course, as they are on the path going to the US, to the north, like they call it, and also as they get there. I think families live in extreme anxiety as well. You know, they're always wondering, like Walter was mentioning, there's always that huge concern about where are they, what is going on with them. And when you ask a family that, you know, have people in the States, and you know, when they talk about them, it's always with great concern, really. You know, what are they eating? What do they find the food that they like? You know, things that are so basic, and you realize that, like Walter was saying, it's not anybody's first option is to migrate. I really don't think it is. I mean, if you had the conditions to stay put where you are and having and having a decent life, migration might not be your first priority. I think in terms of protection, there is a lot of, we've noticed in Rethinking a lot of depression from returnees. They feel like failures, you know, that they got caught by migration, or they got caught, they didn't make it all the way there. They were returned at some point, either from Mexico or something, and they come back and they are depressed. They are seen as losers in the community because they have not been able to make it. So I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done with returnees as well, and not enough is happening in that sense. You know, what the needs of people that are coming back, that are being deported, what are their needs and what can be done. You know, they have a quick welcome little package and stuff, but then their integration is not as easy as we would think. However, there is one great there's one great initiative right now in Guatemala, where they are issuing a lot of temporary visa for workers. So people that are going to harvest, to do a lot of work, garden work and whatnot in the United States. And that is creating a lot of a really good vibe in general, you know, that there are people are going, but that they will be coming back. The ones that are going know that, you know, it's a great opportunity. They are going, they're going to be working hard, they're going to build their little house. And that brings me to the other subject. We know what people invest in when they go to the States, right? We know what they're investing in as they migrate. What is their first investment is in their home. You know, they go from in their home, you know, they want to improve the infrastructure of their home. They want to build a new home. And I think if we had programs in country that would promote is loans or whatever, you know, long-term financing to help people build their homes, maybe they would not have to go away to build their homes.
It's a great point, Pascal. It's back to Walter's point around understanding why people move. Why are they moving in the first place? And what's the real, the dynamics behind that in different age groups and in different locations. Beza, I know your research had some recommendations around how we should think about things differently, or how we should question our current assumptions. Do you want to share some of those with us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it echoes a lot of what others have said, especially, you know, what Walter mentioned is there's this assumption or bias towards seeing migration as a negative thing, and it's In some situations it might be, but I think oftentimes it's a strategy that households rely on, a livelihood strategy. I think in the context of climate change, for example, we can also look at it as an adaptation strategy. People migrate to places where they have opportunities because they can't make a living in areas that are affected by climate change. So I think one recommendation from our research is just the need to reframe how we think of migration as not necessarily a bad thing or a failure of development per se, but as something that has both benefits and challenges, as I was referring to earlier. And what we think, development programs and investments can do more of is really trying to expand those benefits and then minimize the risks or the challenges. And I think how you can do that is by recognizing some people will migrate, and if they migrate, trying to ensure that their migration is informed, that it's safe, and that it's legal. So there are many ways in which we can do that. I think one example that Pascal already gave is through temporary visas or legal pathways for migration, for seasonal migration, things like that, but also things like supporting migrants in the destinations, making sure that they have access to services, labor protections, all sorts of support that they currently don't have, and ensuring also that the family members that remain behind are supported.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I just want to take a second to remind everyone, the Q&A box is open, and we're looking forward to taking questions from you. I see that some are starting to come in. I'm going to revert back to one of my earlier questions for the panel. Actually, no, I'm not. Walter, you brought up key livelihoods strategies and working with people for on key livelihoods strategies related to migration. And as we've started to talk, we talked about climate change, we talked about what it feels like to come back and have failed, and we talked about protection. And I'm just wondering if these things don't start to come together as we talk about what key livelihood strategies might be, particularly recognizing the point that Beza just made around this is a livelihood strategy. It's part of a wider thing that households do to support themselves. What do you in each of your different contexts that you've looked at, what are those key livelihood strategies that we ought to be strengthening for different groups, for youth, for women, for for whomever? Go ahead, please just jump in.
No, thanks, Carrie. If I may, I just want to go back a little on the question that the discussion that talked about the visas in the US. I think we must applaud our governments in Zimbabwe with the National Development Strategy 1. We've seen a very clear focus on the diaspora. And what we are seeing is the government pushing towards looking at labor agreements with destination countries and potentially even having a support mechanism that is set up at embassies and others. I think that is starting to get somewhere. And just another example, I have to be selfish here, being Kenyan, just what this week the president negotiated for our nurses to work in the UK. So people do go and they don't have the setup, but then you can go and do that. But I must also applaud Philippines. My first ever international trip outside Africa was to Philippines. And, you get to the airport at the counter and there's a big counter for overseas workers. And it is such a big setup that every single Filipino who wants to use that channel, and there's millions of them, at that point there was like over 8 million of them registered with the government, being supported across the world wherever they go, whether it's Dubai as workers. And so I think for me, it's a very critical conversation to have and really look at how we can work stronger with the governments to strengthen that approach. Coming back to the livelihood strategy, I think what I must say here, and I even see a question here from the participants on why we shouldn't be supporting people to just stay where they are. I think there's always that debate about, is it sufficient? And as the ecosystems begin to struggle with population pressure, climate change, are we really able to provide for everybody in the location that they live in? And I think about my little village back in Kenya. And I can see it's getting harder and harder for the community there to provide for themselves. Lots of them work in the cities. Why do they do that? Because they can find a wage job to supplement whatever little income that comes from their agricultural practice or their animal rearing. But as we think about how to intensify and make the rural areas more productive, it's also critical to acknowledge that the role that these migrant populations do in terms of building the localities. And I think Pascal's point about we are reinvesting back in the villages. I am here and I'm doing something back in my village. It's still a development. It's going to provide opportunities for others. I think I want to really emphasize Beza's point that it's about making it safe and profitable. It's not to stop it. It's to make sure that people can actually step out there and earn something and they know what it is as they move out. Thank you.
And that it's part of a wider set of livelihoods choices. I mean, I think that's what I do really like about those countries that have visas that allow you to go and come back, and it's a legal channel for a temporary option, and I think in many ways everyone benefits. Both sides get exposed to new ideas or new ways of doing things. In some cases, it fills a skill gap. I know here in the UK, around health workers and the national health system, there's a real need for migrants to come and fill spaces that otherwise would go empty in our own health system. And then that experience is taken back and strengthens the countries where they've come from, and there's lots of evidence around that. How do we push, and I'm going to build off of one of our questions here in the question and answer box, how do we push development structures or donors to be more accommodating of the livelihood opportunities that really are there for people? We are constantly figuring out how to be more flexible and creative, and maybe this is a version of that. But what should we be looking for in new programs?
I would like to respond a bit to this. I think one of the challenges for development donors is this is quite a new area of programming. In some ways, we're used to working with static populations, or what we think to be static populations. And I think part of the challenge with working with migrants, mobile populations, is that our programs are not set up in a way to easily work with them. For example, the way we target programs is really focus on a very specific geography, like this municipality, and that doesn't work in a situation where people are migrating, for example, from one city to another, from one country to another. So I think that challenge can be partly addressed by experimenting or sort of piloting new ways of working with mobile populations, essentially, because this, again, the fact that it's new might make it difficult for donors to invest in sort of big projects that are addressing the needs of mobile populations. But one of our recommendations is investing in small scale pilots that help us understand how we can do this better before we scale it at a larger scale.
Right. And then measuring, right? And doing the case studies, doing webinars like this one, measuring. What are the right things to measure, though? Pascal, Walter, what should we be measuring as we do these proverbial pilots that Beza has and her colleagues have recommended? How do we know that we're doing good migration programming? Sorry, putting you on the spot there.
Yeah, in the case of the livelihoods program, we need to ensure that people have enough on their table to eat. So, we need to look at the hunger scale. We need to look at how much people are eating, with what frequency, and if everybody has enough to eat. And, we still have a lot of cases of chronic malnutrition in Huehuetenango and in the highlands of Guatemala in general. So I think that definitely is something that's a really good indicator. You know, it's something so basic. I think in health also there are a lot of things lots of things that needs to be measured in terms of access and availability, right? Are people using health services? Are women going to the health services to get checked? Are they taking their children? And I think that something that we should be measuring, because it's key, is really how much the local governments and the government itself is investing. Sorry, bus passing. How much the government, the local governments, are really investing in rural areas. I think that's it is something that we need to work. At least in the Northern Triangle, we really need to be working closely with the governments of these areas and make sure that they too are helping and investing more in rural areas. There's so much to be done. And in terms of measurements as well, you know, I've seen a lot of programs in the highlands that are helping women do more beautiful and more better quality weaving and stuff like that, and in clothing and stuff of this sort for the markets, but there are no markets. So I think another thing that we need to look at when we're working in all these livelihoods, I mean, vegetables are easily sold, you know, to neighbors in the local market or whatnot, but there are other things there are all other livelihood activities that can be done, but we need help identifying markets and developing these markets.
Well, and I think we want to go back to your earlier point that, well, first of all, we want to measure a little bit around why are people moving? What is their reason for moving? But you had said when they do come back or when they do send remittances, people put it into their houses. Mm-hmm. So it does make me wonder if we should be looking as we're doing the pilots and looking at migration in a new way. It feels like there's something there. We should be measuring something that is perhaps indirect, but is actually linked to why people migrate or what they do, what they get out of migrating, and then figuring out, and this is building on something you had said, Walter, figuring out what that push-pull is. What is the dynamic of the livelihood strategy that is migration to bring the positive and kind of support those things that are more negative, like irregular migration, but also you talked about the depression and things like that. I don't know, Walter, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to throw in something here. And there's a question, I think there's a question there about how we define migration as a livelihood or an adaptation, but also just come into the whole livelihood debate. I think the more I've been out in villages, the more I realize that we have a very narrow, focused approach to thinking about livelihoods. We do think about livelihoods as what we promote. If we are an agricultural project, we think livelihoods is just the agriculture that we do. If we are a youth kind of labor promoting activity, that's what we think it is. But the experience we are learning as we talk to communities, especially right now in Zimbabwe, as we do our community visioning, is that people have really complex patterns of earning income. And actually, I'd like to refer a book that someone wrote, I can't remember who, but it's called Portfolios of the Poor, if people have seen that. And it talks about how people put very complex, awesome. It puts very complex pieces of incomes and strategies and everything together. So our livelihood is, I think it's a very narrow way of defining a person's outcome. Let me not use the word livelihood outcome here, because the way we've defined it, and the less we can move away from saying this is a farmer to this is a human being who needs to eat and does these 30 things to actually make a living. Some of them are not even easily pronounced because they may be, I don't know what, being a treasurer or gold mining or something that they can't even define in the terminology that we use. And as you think about migration, I think it's always about what does that bring to my table or my wholesome human person income pot. And so the way I look at it, and I would like to ask a bit of conversation on, is that we see people who move as adding to one more other opportunity, one more source of income. Is it an adaptation? I don't know. The literature that I've learned about diversification of livelihood says people tend to have one thing they consider their primary income source, and then they continue building around it. And when they get income, they put it around that. So yes, we see that. We see migrants bringing back money home so that their farmer communities can invest more in farming or something else. But at the end of the day, if you look at the sum total, what you're measuring is, are these households able to provide for their human or their daily needs? And that could be food, could be education, could be medicine, could be, housing. And where the sources of the money come from, they'll keep going to where they find it easier. And that's complex and changes community after community. So I think that's my long-winded response to how we measure, because it's not straightforward, and especially that it's not one livelihood that you need to be looking at for. Right.
I'm going to pull a couple of questions from the Q&A. I realize we're down to our last one or two questions, and I want to give each of you a chance to say your last kind of final thing. But first, we're going to have a question. There's an interesting one here. Whilst migration is mostly driven by the need to look for greener pastures, causing rural-urban migration internally and migration out of across borders, there are also cases where people are forced to migrate because of COVID-19 risks or impacts. Does this sound familiar to any of you? Does this, do you have examples or perspectives on migration that might have been caused by COVID?
I'll go, and I think for me, what we've seen, and I'll use Bangladesh as an example, and most of the other cities, we actually see the opposite, right? When COVID hits, people lose jobs and they actually move to because they can't afford to live in the city anymore, or they can't afford to provide for themselves in the areas, and especially the denser populated areas tend to spread out if they have an opportunity. So I would actually suggest that what we've seen, I don't have research to back it up, but we've actually seen the opposite. And especially during the lockdowns, the day wage earners tend to move back to wherever space it is. And I think that we've seen that create a lot of problems, including exacerbating gender-based violence, creating more negative, behaviors in the communities, drugs and all, just because there's nothing really to do. I must also warn that I think we are still learning about the impact of COVID, and as we see the waves come and go, people are actually dealing very differently wave after wave, including just being ignorant to the fact that COVID can actually harm you and just ignoring whatever is going out there. So I don't know whether I have a precise answer, but I'm just saying that we've seen both movements, and it's not very precise. Sorry, thanks.
But it raises the point that Pascal was making earlier about the feeling that you failed. I can imagine that those who were forced to move home, it wasn't part of the plan. They were forced to move home because of COVID, and now they're no longer able to provide the remittances that they once provided to their family. Some of those issues that Pascal was talking about with, depression and lack of empowerment and that kind of thing. It's another thing to consider as we look at wider migration. Okay, one last question, and then I'd like to hear from each of you. This Cheryl Turner from ACDI VOCA is asking about the relationship between community support from remittances and government support. It seems in many cases, if remittances are supporting community services, then the government withdraws support. So should the development community play a role in bridging that gap, supporting governments to leverage diaspora contributions rather than pull back from them? Is there a role for us in that?
Well, I can't really think of examples of that happening, that the community is investing in a water project or in a school, and that the government would retrieve. But if that is the case, I think definitely there should be a dialogue between the government agencies and the communities and the NGOs to make sure that it's complementary, that whatever is happening is complement what the government is already doing or is willing to do. Ambulance passing. And really try to promote dialogue around the different people interested in working in development in that community, and make sure that it's a concerted effort, and that that brings different funding from different areas and different level of efforts from either the mayor's office if he doesn't have money, but at least that he can help maybe with machinery or whatnot, and really make sure that it all adds up in the community and for the benefit of the people.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry.
To add to that, I think remittances are, in my mind, a very big untapped opportunity for development. I mean, they already play a huge role in development, but we don't think about them in terms of development aid, and how we could also help channel remittances towards productive investments, because currently a lot of remittances tend to be used for consumption rather than investment. But when you think about it, remittances, I think I saw a figure that they are over $500 billion to low middle income countries, and so that's about 3 times the amount of development assistance and more than foreign direct investment. There's a huge potential there, and I think that's one thing where development strategies from donors could think about, again, how can we help channel those remittances into things that are productive and help to develop communities.
So wrapping up what I heard from all of you, we heard, think about how to channel those remittances differently. What strategies can we, the wider community, employ to help steer them in certain directions. We talked about understanding why people move, and recognizing migration as one part of livelihood strategies that is more likely to be temporary than permanent, or maybe different in different contexts. We talked about the need for piloting, and the need for recognizing kind of the protection elements and supporting people either as they're moving or when they return. Some of those maybe being new ways of working that we're not currently doing now. Walter, anything else that you think is really an important point on the opportunities and challenges of migration that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I kind of, and I mean, this whole debate about remittances and how they are used, I think we also need to be a little careful that I know governments will see the money through central banks and everything, but these are incomes that people are given, and I would like to question who of us wants to be told what to do with their salary. So most of these people are actually sending back resources. Can they be utilized in ways to support local economies? I believe they do, and unless it's really little handouts, I mean, little amounts that can't go beyond the daily consumption of the household to which they are remitted. So I think that we need to be cautious about what that means. I think the way I'd like to look at this is the governments acknowledging the role of that and looking at how do they continue to stimulate this. In my own country, the banks are actually stepping in and using a pull effect of trying to open up the diaspora and encouraging them to invest in certain areas. It could be real estate, it could be social activity. So that for me is an opportunity. It may not be the purview of our NGO world, but I think it's something that we could find space to see how we can connect with such private actors who are actually helping consolidate or leverage such opportunities as they exist. Thank you. Great,
thanks. Pascal?
I just wanted to add on what Walter was saying. I think what we've seen as we do focus groups after a cash distribution, for example, because we're doing multi-purpose cash assistance in our programs, it's amazing how people know how to handle their money. They know how to use it. They know how to, I can tell you, I think 80% of the families that receive a cash transfer, they save a little bit for leaner times. You know, they know that it's instinctive. They keep a little bit because, you know, there might be the program might end, and the program will end, and there will be other times, and they need to save a little bit. They have on their own, they take small businesses risk, you know. I mean, a woman would say, you know, every time I got my transfer, I buy a little chick. So, you know, now I have 10 chicks, you know, but 3 of them died or whatnot. How can you help me make sure that they survive? You know, so you realize that there are so many, that people know how to handle their money. It's not going to waste. It's not going for frivolous things. You know, lots of people say when the men are drinking and they take the money from the women. We rarely see that. We really see that the money is very, very smartly used, invested for things that really bring food to the table first, and then make sure that they have health services, that kids can go to school. I am a big fan of the multi-purpose cash assistance programs, because I've seen the results. I've seen the impact on the communities. I've seen the impact on families, on children. The security that it gives them to just have that little input of cash every month is amazing, and takes away a lot of their worries as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Beza, last thoughts for us?
Maybe just to add, I think there's a lot of potential to think creatively in this space around supporting mobile populations, and also around remittances. And fully agree with Walter and Pascal. I think people know how to use their resources better than what we can tell them to do. But there are, I think, opportunities. For example, there's a big movement around helping reduce the cost of remitting, so reducing the fees attached to sending money, where donors and organizations could advocate and work with remittance institutions like Western Union to help bring down those fees, so it is easier to send money back home. So there's a lot of opportunities here, and I'm really glad we're having this conversation.
Great. Thanks, Beza. Thanks for bringing us home there. I'm really sorry. I could happily talk about this topic for hours. I think there's a lot of unexplored areas and a lot of new frontiers for us in this work. But that's all the time we have today. I want to say a massive thank you to our panel. Really, really appreciate you guys being here and sharing your experiences and the work that you've been doing. I'd like to ask all of our attendees, please, there's a link to the evaluation in the chat. If you could take just 2 minutes, fill that out, we would be very grateful, and it really helps us design events that are of the most interest to you, if we know what works and what doesn't work. I hope you've enjoyed today. Feel free to tell us, you know, what more you'd like to hear about in these scale webinars. And finally, just thank you again to all our panelists and to BHA for making this webinar possible. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, and thanks, Carrie, for organizing the webinar, and for everybody who participated. Thank you, and have a great day, afternoon, evening.